Well-being, it's about what happens to you socially. It's about what to you physically, which includes the financial resources you have to support your life. It's about your intellect and the thinking skills that you have, the ability to take risks, to evaluate options that come your way. It also involves your ethnic and cultural self. And this is just part of who we are, and we often have very little understanding about where we come from or the lifestyle we've accidentally fallen into, because often we don't choose it. And then we also look at the emotional self, how we cope with the things that happen to us and what we understand about it. And the final area we look at is spiritual, which is really more about the frameworks and values that you bring to your life and how that impacts you. So we came up with this concept of universal well-being, and that's what our research has been following now for 16 years.
Hey Susan, thank you for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you. You are actually the first person we're doing remotely. Yeah, we typically do our recordings for Ways to Wealth in person, but we wanted to experiment with online as well. So we're really excited to do a few episodes like this too. And you are Susan Stevenson, and you are working with the Freedom Wellbeing Institute. That is super topical about what we're doing as well. So I'm so excited to talk to you about kind of your views and the work you guys have been doing in the wellbeing space, and perhaps get into a bit of your kind of background and what led you to this moment, and just generally talk about kind of ways to wealth in general. And we think of ways to wealth of how do you design a great life, and how do you help people with relatable stories kind of talk about and learn from your experience. So I'll give you the floor to just introduce yourself, Susan. So tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can get into the pod.
As you said, my name is Susan Stevenson, and I'm actually the director of a company called Freedom Wellbeing Institute. I should also perhaps share I'm also the director of another company I started called the New Zealand Curriculum Design Institute. So I have since 2008 been progressing passions in education and also in supporting people to just feel better every day. Historically, in my work, I've spent a lot of time working with people, sort of ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, people with major issues and challenges. And I guess in 2008 and then in 2013, when I started a Freedom Wellbeing Institute, I decided to tip my efforts into what I call prevention wellbeing. So to really start focusing on solving the problems and trying to prevent the awful things that happen to people from happening. We know a lot about why bad things happen to people, and I really think particularly in New Zealand we need to shift to preventing this and using the skills and capabilities of so many companies like yours that are working to help people just have a better, happier life. So that's really where my focus is, and I guess it's come out of some of the pretty awful situations I've worked in and dealt with: at-risk youth, people in prisons, people failing in the education system, and trying to shift and turn around those sorts of outcomes is really a big motivator for me.
Awesome. I'm so excited to talk to you because I think it's so topical, and we deal with these things every day in our lives. Now, I'm going to start off with not a book recommendation, but a book that had a large influence on myself that I think you may enjoy, which it's called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. And what it talks to, and I guess it's a little bit different from kind of youth at risk or people in prisons, but it has a relatively, there is a connection there, but it's definitely appropriate for people that take risks and try and do good work, but there's an unknown outcome. So the book is all about disassociating outcomes from decisions. So you can make a good decision, but not necessarily, or a well-informed decision, should I say, but not necessarily have a great outcome. And it's often those outcomes that drive a lot of despair, right? So yeah, I thought that was an interesting kind of little book to talk about. It's one of my favorites, and it's definitely influenced me, obviously being an entrepreneur, dealing with plenty of unknown situations. So, you've started the Institute in 23. I guess, did you start slightly before then? Is that when it kind of got going? Like, how long was it in the making before you started it?
I will tell you, when I started the New Zealand Curriculum Design Institute, we were helping organisations with quality of education and programs and trying to get better and better outcomes. And really what I came to see by 2013 2013, through research that I started back in 2008, I started to see that, in fact, we could make some inroads into some areas in terms of wellbeing. So our wellbeing work has kind of had a life of its own. I will say, apart from doing a research study that started in 2008 and has been ongoing since, I didn't make a great long plan at that point in time, but it's like each study we did led to something else, which led to something else, which led to something else. So it's been really kind of intriguing, and I almost feel like, although I'm the research program leader, I almost feel like I've been following rather than leading this, because I guess if you're finding out things that is interesting and valuable to people, people want you to do more of it. And so the momentum kind of gains. And that's really how Freedom came about. It was really because the momentum was just growing and we really needed a vehicle to begin to be what we wanted to be, which was universal wellbeing catalysts. And we wanted to be thought leaders in the way that people think about wellbeing. So we often find that the people we meet think about wellbeing to their businesses, for example. They think of it as a cost and expense. They think about having to go and employ EAP people or clinical psychologists, all those sorts of things. But what we could see is about 90% of people usually don't need clinical services, but they are concerned with doing better. They do want to do better than they have been doing. They want to feel well, they want to have more resources and money, and they want to understand themselves and their lives. And so we started to see that the people interested in well-being, or people with a stake in well-being, weren't just people with, for example, mental health challenges. Actually, everybody's got a stake in it. And we could see that most people want to optimise how they're doing. And so our work has really been focused on trying to understand, first of all, what well-being is. And I can quickly tell you there's nearly 1,000 definitions of well-being. But if you start to look at how many of those have any research behind them, it's less than 5, right? And then we started looking at the way people understand well-being as being, within definitions that exist, like mental health. And what we could see is actually well-being it's about what happens to you socially. It's about what to you physically, which includes the financial resources you have to support your life. It's about your intellect and the thinking skills that you have, the ability to take risks, to evaluate options that come your way. It also involves your ethnic and cultural self. And this is just part of who we are. And we often have very little understanding about where we come from or the lifestyle we've accidentally fallen into, because often we don't choose it. And then we also look at the emotional self, how we cope with the things that happen to us and what we understand about it. And the final area we look at is spiritual, which is really more about the frameworks and values that you bring to your life and how that can impact you. So we came up with this concept of universal well-being, and that's what our research has been following now for 16 years. And so this concept kind of opens up people from thinking it's a little tiny thing to actually understanding this is a much bigger picture. So a big part of our research is focused on developing this universal wellbeing evaluation tool, so people can actually find out the status of their well-being, so they can find out if finance is something that's actually impacting all parts of their well-being. And most people have a rough idea, but not really.
What we found with the consultation program that we've put together, the financial wellbeing program we've put together and we've been rolling out over the last couple of months, and it's a framework that actually I used initially when I had finished at the first company I'd built, and we were in the process of kind of selling that to another company and we were going to go work with this other company as well. And, when you're in the thick of it in that stage, I was just thinking about, and I just had my third child, and all I was thinking about was kind of muddling along and trying to get this deal done. And then the dust settled, and I was like, well, now I want to start thinking about building wealth. And I hadn't really thought about that prior because I was just on the kind of road of trying to build, I guess, my first kind of business that had employees as an example, right? So we had employees and we were moving into a situation where we had had a larger company that was going to be directing us in a sense. And then I took that kind of opportunity to set out, okay, well, what does good look like? What does freedom look like from a wealth perspective? And what does discipline look like from a wealth perspective? And I'm not talking about investing. And I think that, my interest is in markets and investing. And it's, a passion of mine, calling in a sense that I just love it so much. I love business so much. And obviously markets are a great way to represent that. And that's kind of, for me, it's the pursuit of that game that's interesting. But actually, it's very different to financial well-being in many ways, because that is about kind of happiness and less stress and a kind of a systematic knowing that everything's okay. And what we found from the program, and obviously the research that kind of led to us building out this program, was that just showing where everything is and what it looks like, that's half the battle. Because if you have something in the back of your head that's gnawing on your psyche and you haven't confronted it, it will feed into the other parts of your life. And by putting it front of mind and saying, this is where we're at, okay? And we all start at different starting lines and we'll all finish at different finish lines, but this is where we're at today. And then the answers become clear. It's like, okay, I can make this change. And it's actually just because they see it in front of them and we've got great tools for visualizing things, the answers kind of become clear on their own. You don't necessarily need, like you said, a clinical psychologist in some ways. Sometimes you don't need more financial products. You just need to know what are the fundamentals of the current situ and then how do you work from there. And I find it very interesting that, freedom, as you call it. So you really just call it freedom? Yeah, so freedom is interesting because when we've talked and we've recorded now, we started in, I think, April or May, the podcast, and we have recorded 45 episodes so far. And freedom, when we ask people, what does wealth mean to you? 90% of people will say freedom. Freedom of time, but I think what you say as well, it's freedom of thought. So I really love what you're doing. I think that finance is often overlooked when we think about well-being, and it's considered in its own category, but it has obviously implications across all areas of our lives.
Well, one of the things that we do when we do these evaluations is they show what people are great at. So there's a strengths component, and most people don't actually realize the areas where they have good well-being are usually the areas they've actually put a lot of effort into. But they can also identify areas where definitely there's harm occurring or some kind of modificational change is necessary. Something is happening or several things that are causing something else to happen. It might be, for example, they've got financial challenges, but it might be because they started gambling when their best friend passed away or things like that. So we can often help people put together the interlinked pieces. But I think financial freedom is particularly important because some aspects of being free are about survival. And if you can't meet your basic needs, kind of you don't have the headspace to think of other things because this thing is overshadowing you. And within our program, if we find people who have financial challenges, we look at getting them supports from appropriate people depending on the nature of the financial challenge they have. And what I agree with you, there's so many products out there, and frankly, there's so many salespeople out there that often people, they don't need a lot of time. They just need the right solutions, that are from the right place to help them. And so anything we refer people to, we really look at what is this, and is this a solution we would stand behind and work with? But it's absolutely one of the most critical areas in life. And I think I feel kind of privileged that I grew up in a family that taught me how to make and save and invest money over time. And I'd say my first lesson was around the ability to work hard. Often not one job, but multiple jobs, and then moved to a point where I began to go, this money needs to start working for me now. I worked for it, but now it's start giving something back to me. And that's a major transition. If people can realize that, I often have worked with people in my life who've said, I don't want to go into a job. I don't want to work for the man. And, it's kind of like a thought pattern. And I've often said, well, who is the man? And for them, it's kind of about the idea of working for someone else as a problem, well, you're not working for that person, you're working for your goals. And, you're really building a nest egg, which allows you to then, start doing something with that, developing that freedom and actually getting a return on your hard work. Lots of people come at finances in different ways, but I think we don't need to have poverty, is my view. There is quite a pathway people can follow, which does require, and you used the D word, which does require discipline. It's kind of like having something so compelling that you want so much that you are prepared to do some different things or make some changes to get to that point. And I think that's the critical component in terms of whether people build the financial resources they want to or not, is really dedicating themselves to that for a period in their life.
And it's that initial period that kind of sets the foundation, isn't it? And it's often a catalyst, or it could be either forced, or it could be a book that they picked up, or it could be a holiday where they had the headspace to think differently. I often find that going to a different location physically is a great way to unlock new pathways, because it just puts you in a different perspective. And obviously life is often about perspective. Was there a moment in your life where, because you said you had obviously the grounding from your family around money and savings and kind of a better future, was there a moment that you can remember, or a catalyst in your life where you started thinking about, okay, I'm going to make a conscious effort in this part of my life? Or was it just something that was always second nature?
Actually, I will recall one of the most powerful experiences in my childhood. I remember my father was trying to encourage me and my brothers and sister not to smoke. And one day he told me how in his youth as a young man he had smoked. And he pulled out at that point it was a £10 note. He pulled out a £10 note and he actually lit it with a match so it burnt. Now for me as a child watching that, I'm like, that is so much money. That is so much money. And he made this point. He said, does it make sense that people who smoke do this all the time? They earn money and then they just burn it and it disappears in the smoke. And I remember this had a really powerful impact on me, because I thought, wow, as a child, I used to do things like collect mint to make money. So I was running all these, I was the kind of kid who ran the lemonade stand and that sort of thing. And I remember seeing this money and hearing my father talk about it and how he just went cold turkey on smoking, because there was a point where his family mattered more than this habit. And he started to feel he was being enslaved to this habit of cigarette smoking. And when he sat back and thought about what it was, essentially he was burning his money, literally. And I think that was a very powerful image, because I think often people have money and resources, but they're not really thinking about, am I making this work for me, or am I using this in a way that gives me freedom and choices and bigger options in my life. But that had a profound impact on me. I have to say I never smoked or even tried to my whole life. That message was forever ingrained in my mind, as you'd have to be stupid to be making money and burning it, which was fundamentally the lesson that he taught me. Yeah.
That's really cool. So do you have kids?
Yes, I do. I have 6 sons.
Wow. So did you talk about finances and budgeting and like that with your kids? And what does that look like?
I have to say, finances were really something children, I think, learn from a young age. Often children get, for example, pocket money. In my world, my children got pocket money, but pocket money was kind of earned. So you had these things you contributed to the family, and then you got pocket money. It wasn't like you get this money as a right. So I guess that link between effort and money was always there. And I do remember my parents doing things like, I remember my mother had this great idea that she would give me so much money because she was sick of me asking and wanting clothes, like a typical teenage girl. And she said, I'm going to give you this much money and I'm going to give you a sewing machine and you can do whatever you like. So essentially, it's that thing about fishing. She gave me the means to create, not only to create things for myself, but if I wanted to, I could create things and make money through that activity. And I think those were really powerful moments where you realized you had the means actually at the tip of your fingers to make more and to achieve what you wanted. And I think you gain a lot of confidence when you grow up in a situation where people are linking, having things to your efforts, and you start to feel, I can do this, I can achieve. I think those linkages are really profound.
I have interesting conversations with my kids about money and about investing quite often. I'll take a company that maybe is public and I will talk to my son about it. I've also I've talked about the concepts of the value that people perceive around physical objects that may not have a cash flow. You have companies that have cash flow, and you have, companies that he likes because he knows them. And then you have things that people perceive to have a certain value, for example, like Rolexes. And I've had thought experiments with him where I've asked him about Rolexes, I guess, and cups. I said, perhaps all of a sudden people want to pay $30 for a cup, a mug like this, and then trying to gauge to him that it's often, it's a perceived value that people put on things that may not make rational sense sometimes. And then I put it back to Rolexes, and he goes, oh, well, I wouldn't want to buy a Rolex. I would short Rolexes. I would sell Rolexes because in the future we'll have different materials and no one will want Rolexes anymore. And then in the case of I asked him the other day what he wanted to be, and then he said, oh, well, I don't want to basically, or he was a bit disparaging about working because he's like, oh, well, I just have to work and then I give money to the government, which I thought was an interesting view because I hadn't actually spoken to him specifically about that. In our household, we mainly talk about why taxation exists rather than taxation being a thing that is just taken. He goes, well, you guys pay loads of tax and they just take all your money. And I'm like, well, actually, we don't pay that much tax. We're not super wealthy or anything. And we pay what's prescribed based on the year that it is. And both my wife and I are self-employed, basically, because we're both business owners. So that also has more of a varying effect than a salaried employee. But I said, well, like you say, it's not about feeling an obligation around, work is more about, oh, I have to give some of it away rather than I'm doing something I enjoy and love. For a while, he's been saying he wants to be a CEO, which I find quite funny, but he's not quite found a passion other than soccer that has given him, I think, a inspiration of what a job could look like. And it's very difficult for us as parents, I think, right now to think, well, how am I going to prepare him for the future? And I guess from my perspective, I would say that fractional incomes are quite appealing, and I think perhaps they'll be appealing for the next 50 years because then it creates less fragility in your life. So if you can find ways to get multiple streams of income, then you get potentially an opportunity to not be beholden to a certain path, and that may create, I guess, subsequent freedom. The question I was thinking about in my head around if someone was feeling like they didn't have freedom and that their well-being wasn't quite where they wanted to be, or they feel like there had been a clear deterioration and they didn't feel like they could get out of it instantly, and working harder, right, which is often the initial reaction, is to work harder to get out of a mess, wasn't working, and in fact it might even be making it worse. What are the actions that they can take today to start to make small effects?
One of the things I would say that we find people can do, and I go back to this universal wellbeing evaluation, like not only can this evaluation tell people about the state of 70 influences on your wellbeing. So most people do this evaluation, go, whoa, I never thought all of this is impacting me. But one of the things we can do is we can also look at how is home or work, or for example, a study setting impacting your wellbeing. Because sometimes, we often find, as you can imagine, people who have very low wellbeing scores in their workplace. And so often, seeing and discussing this with a facilitator and starting to see in absolute clarity, this workplace is not great. And they might see, well, I can't share my ideas. I'm not accepted emotionally. It doesn't make much money. So people can, from the evaluation, begin to go, whoa, actually, maybe I need to do something else, or maybe I need to look for a job. And we've had people who've just, had their reports and actually made changes into business, for example, into a different kind of job or work, because it's come into sharp focus what their actual situation is. And often people don't think being unhappy at work is anything to do with their well-being and how sick they're getting, or, the way their money is being managed and things, or the quality of their decisions. But in fact, these things are very interlinked. And I think I was really interested in your point about your son and the conversation about value, because, we're often unclear even what well-being is. So how do you value it? We often know if we're sick, so we think, oh yeah, I need to be healthy. But we don't realize that well-being encompasses all of that and much more, including our finance. So it's a great opportunity essentially to take a stock take and to get the big picture of what is happening and how often these things are kind of interrelating to each other, So it's amazing how these things unfold, and you see connections between things that come up from this evaluation that really give people insights. And clearly finances are a big issue for people. For some people, the value is about, I just want to feel better every day. Particularly since COVID, I think a lot of people feel like, I used to feel about a 90, 100 most of the time. Now I feel like a 60 or 70, and I'm not really sure, why I'm down here. They have this awareness. And so, it's starting to build the awareness of why you've moved from where you were to here, and what can you do about it, that sort of thing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think that's an awesome place to end. I really appreciate the work you're doing, Susan, and coming on the podcast and having a chat to us. I think lots of people are going to find it valuable, and they can find the work you do at freedom-ihe.ac.nz. Is that right?
Or they can even find it at www.fwi.ac.nz. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Much appreciated.
Nice to work with you, and I wish you guys all the best with what you're doing. Sounds fabulous.